Glasgow, a city of strong spirit, steel, and history, once hid a darkness so deep it earned the title the murder capital of Europe. Behind the proud faces of shipyard workers and the echoes of bagpipes lay a brutal underworld ruled by fear. Entire neighborhoods became territories, every street corner marked by blood, and every night filled with the sound of broken glass and sirens. The gangs that rose here weren't petty criminals. They were soldiers of the streets, loyal to nothing but power and respect. Names like the Billy Boys, the Tongs, and the Calton Crew sent chills through the city. They fought not for wealth, but for pride. Their weapons were blades, their laws written in blood. Police had no control, and even ordinary citizens learned to live by gang rules. But how did Glasgow, a proud Scottish city, descend into such chaos? How did street loyalty turn into organized crime empires that ruled for decades? This is the untold truth of Glasgow's deadliest gangs. A story of murder, betrayal, and power, where every victory came at the cost of another man's life. Glasgow, once known for its industrial greatness, hides a violent and blood-soaked history that most people outside Scotland have never truly understood. Behind its thriving shipyards and hard-working communities, there was another Glasgow, one built on fear, loyalty, and violence. For decades, this city was home to some of the most dangerous gangs in the world, each fighting to control the streets, the money, and the power. It began in the poverty-stricken neighborhoods, where unemployment, sectarian divides, and hopelessness gave rise to a new kind of street brotherhood. These weren't just groups of thugs. They were organized, disciplined, and deeply feared. Every area had its rulers, every street corner had its defenders, and every night could end in blood. From the Billy Boys marching through the Protestant districts to the Norman conks defending their Catholic strongholds, Glasgow was split in two, a city at war with itself. Over time, the fights grew deadlier. The weapons changed from razors and belts to guns and bombs, and as decades passed, the gang wars evolved from neighborhood battles into powerful criminal networks controlling drugs, money laundering, and extortion. But even through all the violence and chaos, one thing never changed: the code of the streets. Loyalty, revenge, and reputation meant everything. Breaking that code meant death. In this documentary, we dive deep into the dark heart of Glasgow's gang culture, the brutal history, the bloody turf wars, and the rise of gang leaders who became legends of fear. This isn't just the story of crime, it's the story of a city that bled, fought, and survived through generations of violence. Welcome to Inside Glasgow's Deadliest Gangs, Murders, Power, and Turf Wars. The story of Glasgow's gang culture begins in the early 1900s, a time when the city was booming with industry, shipbuilding, ironworks, and trade. But behind the success, life for the working class was harsh. Families were crammed into overcrowded tenements, unemployment was rising, and poverty bred frustration and anger. Out of these conditions, a new identity began to form among the city's youth, one defined by loyalty, toughness, and survival. At first, these street groups were small, formed to protect their own neighborhoods from outsiders. They offered young men a sense of belonging that the system had denied them. But soon, the rivalries grew fierce. Religion also fueled the divide. Protestant and Catholic tensions, already simmering across Scotland, turned the streets into battlefields. The most notorious names, the Billy Boys from Bridgeton and the Norman conks from the Catholic areas, clashed violently. Their hatred wasn't just about faith. It was about territory, pride, and control. By the 1920s, Glasgow had earned a terrifying nickname, the Razor City. The gangs carried blades, belts, and razors, weapons that symbolized both status and fear. Marches and parades became power shows, where gangs would sing violent chants and threaten their enemies. To outsiders, it looked like chaos, but to those inside, it was a way of life. a warped code of honor built on loyalty and revenge. The city's police were overwhelmed. Law enforcement struggled to contain the violence because the gangs operated with military discipline. Young men joined for respect, women for protection, and children grew up idolizing gang leaders like local heroes. In neighborhoods like the Gorbals and Calton, joining a gang wasn't a choice. It was survival. Authorities tried to intervene through arrests and crackdowns, but the roots of the problem went deeper. Glasgow's economy was collapsing, families were broken, and hope was fading. For many, the gang offered the only identity worth living, or dying, for. This was how Glasgow's gang culture was born, from poverty, pride, and pain. What began as small street fights soon spiraled into a violent subculture that would dominate the city for decades. And as the bloodshed spread, it became clear. Glasgow wasn't just a city with gangs. It was a city ruled by them. By the 1950s and 1960s, Glasgow's gang problem had evolved from isolated brawls into an all-out war for control. The city was divided like a battlefield, each district marked by the names of gangs that commanded absolute loyalty. From Bridgeton to the Gorbals, from Calton to Maryhill, every block had its soldiers, young men armed not just with blades, but with burning pride. What began as local rivalries had now become a full-blown culture of violence, woven deep into Glasgow's identity. The Tongs ruled Bridgeton, their name whispered with both fear and respect. In Calton, rival groups fought endlessly to defend their turf. Even teenagers carried knives, believing that power came through violence. Every weekend, the streets transformed into war zones. Fights erupted after dances, football matches, or chance encounters. The police knew where the blood would fall, but often arrived too late to stop it. For these young men, violence wasn't mindless. It was ritual. Every battle had meaning. To retreat was weakness, and to show mercy was unthinkable. Gang members wore their scars like trophies, and reputations were worth dying for. A single insult, a wrong look, or a trespass across invisible borders could ignite chaos. The gangs operated with a twisted form of honor. If one member was attacked, the entire group responded. There were codes, rules, and hierarchies. The leaders, often older, battle-hardened men, demanded loyalty above all else. Betrayal was punished brutally, and respect was earned only through blood. The more violent you were, the more respected you became. The city's working-class despair only added fuel to the fire. Jobs were disappearing, housing conditions were horrific, and entire communities were drowning in poverty. To many, joining a gang was not rebellion. It was a way to be seen, a way to belong. The government's failure to address social decay left a void that the gangs were only too happy to fill. By the late 1960s, knife fights turned into organized riots. Rival groups would plan attacks days in advance, arming themselves with bottles, chains, and makeshift weapons. Hospitals were flooded every weekend with victims, some injured, others dead. Parents feared letting their children out after dark, and neighborhoods became no-go zones for outsiders. The newspapers called it Scotland's youth crisis, but the truth was darker. Glasgow wasn't dealing with a generation of rebels. It was dealing with a generation born into hopelessness. In the absence of opportunity, gangs became a distorted family, offering identity, power, and protection. Meanwhile, the police were fighting a losing battle. Traditional methods of law enforcement didn't work against groups that were more loyal to each other than to their own futures. Raids, arrests, and curfews only created martyrs and strengthened the gang's grip. Some officers admitted privately that they feared certain neighborhoods as much as the public did. As the violence escalated, the rest of Britain began to see Glasgow not as Scotland's industrial heart, but as a symbol of lawlessness, a city defined by fear and blood. The nickname No Mean City became both an insult and a badge of honor, immortalized in books and songs. But beneath the chaos, something was changing. The older generation of gang leaders began realizing there was more to gain from control than chaos. The idea of power through organization was slowly taking root. Street fights would soon give way to something far more dangerous. A new era of organized crime, where violence would become business and blood would buy influence. This was the peak of Glasgow's bloody gang wars, an age where honor meant violence, and violence meant survival. The city had lost control of its streets, and the gangs had tasted power too intoxicating to ever give up. The next stage wouldn't be fought in alleys, but in boardrooms and backrooms, where crime wore suits, not scars. By the 1970s, Glasgow's streets began to change, not because the violence had stopped, but because it had evolved. The loud, bloody brawls that once defined the city started fading into the shadows. The smart gang leaders realized something crucial. Violence attracted police attention, but money brought real power. The battlefield was no longer the street. It was the underworld of drugs, smuggling, and organized crime. This was the era when Glasgow's gangs transformed into criminal empires. The same men who once ruled with razors now controlled with cash. They began importing drugs, running protection rackets, and managing illegal gambling rings. The once aimless violence became strategic. Every hit, every deal, every murder had purpose. The police weren't chasing street thugs anymore. They were up against well-connected, well-financed criminal networks. One of the major turning points came with the introduction of heroin and amphetamines into Glasgow. The city's poverty made it the perfect breeding ground for addiction, and the gangs saw opportunity. Entire communities were destroyed as drug use soared and gang profits skyrocketed. Families that had once feared gang fights now feared losing their children to drugs. The same gangs that claimed to protect their neighborhoods were now poisoning them from within. As their influence grew, gang leaders became businessmen, in appearance at least. Expensive suits replaced leather jackets, and meetings took place in pubs, clubs, and offices. Deals were made with criminals from across the UK and even abroad. They laundered money through legitimate businesses, blending into the city's economic fabric. But behind the facade, the same brutality ruled. Betrayal still meant death. Anyone who crossed the line, whether a rival dealer, an informant, or even a friend, met the same fate as those who had fallen in the street wars decades earlier. The police, now facing this new wave of organized crime, were outmatched. The old methods of patrolling and arresting street gangs no longer worked. These criminals operated with silence and strategy. Evidence was hard to find, and witnesses were too terrified to speak. The city's justice system was being manipulated by the very people it was supposed to stop. The transformation wasn't just criminal. It was cultural. The idea of the gangster had changed. The rough, bloodied street fighters had become local legends, admired for their power and feared for their ruthlessness. Movies, songs, and stories romanticized the gangsters' lives, portraying them as kings of the city rather than criminals. This created a dangerous illusion, one that drew in a new generation eager to live like their idols. But the wealth came at a heavy cost. The violence didn't vanish, it simply became more calculated. Car bombings, assassinations, and disappearances replaced open knife fights. The police found bodies dumped in rivers, warehouses burned down as warnings, and entire communities silenced by fear. By the 1980s, Glasgow was living under a quiet reign of terror. The gangs no longer needed to fight for territory. They owned it. Money, drugs, and influence gave them power beyond the law. Politicians, businessmen, and even some law enforcement officials were rumored to have ties with underworld figures. The line between crime and authority blurred dangerously. This was the dark evolution of Glasgow's gangs, from street soldiers to criminal strategists. They had learned that fear could build empires just as easily as it destroyed lives. The bloodshed had become business, and business was booming. Yet as the years went on, the weight of their empire began to crack. Too many deaths, Too many secrets, and too much greed meant that Glasgow's criminal underworld was heading toward its next inevitable phase, a brutal police crackdown that would finally test how untouchable these gang lords truly were. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Glasgow's criminal world was reaching a dangerous boiling point. The city's underworld had become so powerful that it seemed untouchable. Drug empires flourished in silence, illegal money flowed freely, and fear ruled every dark corner. For years, the police watched helplessly as these crime syndicates grew richer and more ruthless. But when the violence started spilling back into the open, when innocent people began dying in crossfires, Scotland decided enough was enough. It was time for a full-scale war on organized crime. The first real shift came when law enforcement began using intelligence-led policing, gathering information from insiders, wiretaps, and surveillance instead of waiting for crimes to happen. Undercover officers infiltrated bars and garages where drug deals were arranged. Task forces were created specifically to track major crime families, following the trail of drugs, money, and murder across the city. It wasn't just about arrests anymore. It was about dismantling entire networks. But going after Glasgow's underworld wasn't easy. These gangs had deep roots in the community. Some ran legitimate businesses as fronts, others had connections within local councils, and a few had even gained political influence. Witnesses were too terrified to testify, knowing full well that snitching meant death. One police officer described it as fighting ghosts. Everyone knew who the criminals were, but no one dared to speak their names. The turning point came with Operation Blade and Operation Maple, two of the largest anti-gang initiatives Scotland had ever launched. The police began using new technology and surveillance laws to gather evidence against gang leaders. Raids swept through Glasgow's most dangerous districts, uncovering drugs, weapons, and millions in cash. The arrests shook the city. Men once considered untouchable were now behind bars. But success came at a price. Violence surged as power vacuums opened. When one crime boss fell, others fought viciously to take his place. Gun battles erupted in the streets, cars were set ablaze, and revenge killings became common. It was as if the underworld was tearing itself apart from the inside. One of the most shocking cases was the murder of Desmond Noonan, a powerful figure whose death symbolized the end of an era. His assassination sent shockwaves through the underworld and proved that no one, no matter how feared, was safe. The killings that followed painted a grim picture. Loyalty meant nothing, and money was the only god left. Meanwhile, the police kept pushing. New initiatives focused on prevention, not just punishment. They began targeting young people, those most at risk of being drawn into gang life, with education programs and community outreach. Former gang members were hired to mentor at-risk youth, sharing their own stories of prison, addiction, and regret. For the first time, Glasgow wasn't just trying to fight crime. It was trying to heal the wounds it had carried for decades. Still, the fight was far from over. Even as the older gangs fell, smaller, more fragmented groups emerged. The drug trade adapted, going underground with more sophisticated tactics. Organized crime never truly disappeared. It just evolved once again, quieter, smarter, harder to detect. But the legacy of those years left deep scars. Entire communities were lost to addiction. Families were broken by violence and fear. And while Glasgow began to rebuild its reputation, the ghosts of its past lingered in every shadowed alley. The 1990s crackdown marked a turning point, the first time the city truly stood up to its criminal masters. The combination of law enforcement pressure, public outrage, and community action began to push the gangs out of the spotlight. Yet those who lived through it knew the truth. Crime never truly dies in Glasgow. It only hides. By the dawn of the 2000s, the city had changed, cleaner, safer, and prouder. But beneath that transformation lay the memories of a war that lasted generations. A war fought not just between gangs and police, but between the darkness of Glasgow's past and the light of what it was trying to become. The city was healing, yes, but it would forever remember the years when fear ruled the streets and blood decided power. Today, when you walk through the streets of Glasgow, the shining waterfront, the bustling city center, the proud music and art scenes, it's hard to imagine the blood that once stained these same streets. The Glasgow of the 21st century is a city reborn. But under the surface, in the whispers of old neighborhoods and the stories told by older generations, the memory of its violent past still lives on. The legacy of the gangs is not just written in the history books, it's carved into the city's soul. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took years of social reform, police persistence, and most importantly, the courage of communities to finally confront what had defined them for generations, the culture of violence. Former gang members, many now middle-aged, began to speak out. Some had lost friends, brothers, even sons to the same streets they once ruled. Their message was raw and powerful. We fought for nothing. These men became living testaments to the cost of Glasgow's gang wars. Community programs began to take shape. Initiatives like the Violence Reduction Unit, VRU, were launched, not to punish, but to prevent. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. Treat violence as a disease, not just a crime. The VRU went into schools, youth clubs, and communities to talk about respect, opportunity, and change. They gave young people alternatives to the streets. They listened, where generations before had ignored. And it worked. Slowly but surely, knife crime and gang recruitment began to decline. But Glasgow's redemption wasn't just about statistics. It was about identity. The city started to rewrite its image, from the murder capital of Europe to a model of transformation. The same neighborhoods once feared for gang violence became examples of resilience. The people who grew up surrounded by chaos now became the ones leading the change. Social workers, activists, and former criminals worked side by side to rebuild what had been destroyed: trust, community, and pride. Still, the past was never completely buried. Some of the old gangs' influence lingers, reappearing in new forms: organized drug networks, underground deals, and youth cliques trying to revive old reputations. But the difference today is awareness. The city knows the cost of silence. Police collaboration with communities has improved. People no longer turn a blind eye to crime. The fear that once controlled Glasgow has been replaced by a collective will to never go back. There are also those who choose to keep the memory alive through storytelling. Documentaries, films, and books retell the brutal history not to glorify it, but to remind future generations where the line between survival and destruction lies. Glasgow's music, especially in rap and hip-hop, often reflects the voices of young people who've grown up hearing tales of the Tongs and the Billy Boys, mixing history with modern identity. The city doesn't deny its dark past anymore. It owns it, learns from it, and grows beyond it. Yet, the emotional scars remain. For the families who lost loved ones in the gang wars, peace doesn't erase the pain. The names of those killed in street fights or overdoses still echo in conversations, memorials, and songs. The older generation, once caught in the chaos, now watch their children and grandchildren walk safely through streets that were once battle zones, and that alone is a victory. In the end, Glasgow's story is not one of endless violence, but of redemption through resilience. The city that was once ruled by fear has learned to fight back, not with blades or blood, but with education, empathy, and unity. It's a reminder that even in the darkest places, transformation is possible. Glasgow will always carry its history, the gangs, the murders, the turf wars, as part of its identity. But today, it stands as proof that a city once divided by violence can become united by hope. Because sometimes, the most powerful story isn't the fall, it's the rise after the ruin.